Scouting? We don't need scouting. We need food. Welcome to Console Empires. In today's video, I'll show you how to push deer with a controller, and share a few other hints and tips about hunting and scouting in Age of Empires 2 on Xbox. Let's go. Deer are one of the best sources of early food. They collect fast like a boar, but decay slow like a sheep. Because of this, many players push all their deer every game, or at least attempt to, because having that extra bit of fast food can make your transition into feudal that much smoother, or allow for faster builds that wouldn't be possible without the deer giving you that extra boost of food income. Sounds great, right? So why not always take them? Well, you're trading three things for that extra food: APM, scouting information, and control over your own resources. If pushing the deer causes you to idle the TC or lose a villager to your boar, it's not going to be worth it, at least until you've gotten some practice. And if you push all the deer before finding your sheep, it's going to make it easier for your opponent to lame you. But most players don't lane, and because of that, it's become meta to push 3 deer every game. So it's not a huge risk to delay scouting in favor of the push, because your opponent is likely doing the same thing, which I'm personally not a huge fan of. Scouting your opponent is more fun than pushing deer, but the food boost from the deer is just too valuable to forgo entirely. And if you're at the level where you want to be pushing anyway, you can probably infer what your opponent is likely to do without actually needing to scout it. So for example, if your opponent is Magyars, they're going to come at you with scouts 9 times out of 10. Maybe men-at-arms, but you can judge that based on their uptime without actually looking, as men-at-arm builds are going to be a few villagers slower than playing scouts. Given that context, you don't actually gain a ton of useful intel from scouting early. You already know what they're going to do from the start, and how to play against it, but you would lose out on that tasty deer. So bringing it all together, it's usually worth it to push at least one. But the decision making has as much to do with the metagame as the actual yield of the deer itself. Because of this, some players think deer pushing should be nerfed, or if you're chaotic, that laming should be buffed. My take is that the deer spawning further out on Arabia was a good change and was enough to make the push more of a decision for actually most players, remembering that most players are below 1100. But that wasn't a strong enough nerf to deter mid or high level players from pushing them all every game anyway. Not necessarily that that's a bad thing. Everyone takes all their boars too, and luring those wasn't an intended mechanic to start with either. For me, I try to push 1, maybe 2 on Arabia, assuming that they didn't spawn awkwardly like behind a woodline. I rarely go for all 3, and sometimes if it's a tricky looking push, I'll just let them be. On other maps though, like Arena or Hideout, Black Forest, the deer tend to be closer, and that early food in your build order on a closed map can be more critical. When there's extra, like a double patch, or if you're playing a map with extra hunt, like Scandinavia, building a mill by the deer can be a good way to go, especially if you're Japanese, as the resource camps are half price. It's also possible to combine the two methods, placing a mill on the patch and then still pushing deer up to it with the scout. Okay, so how do we actually do this? So the deer will run away from most units, not horses though, and the scouts can't attack them either, so most of the time you're going to want to push with the scout. But on Nomad, it can actually be worth doing it with a villager too, although that's somewhat difficult, especially with magnetism, as the cursor is going to want to stick to the deer and make you kill it instead of pushing it. So what you want to do is line up the scout behind the deer and just follow it back to the town center. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, sometimes the deer is dead set on trolling you. There's a bit of randomness in exactly where they go when you push them, largely influenced by your angle of approach and if there's anything in the way, but pathing is pathing, so sometimes they just do what they want. When you get the deer back to the TC, grab 2 to 4 vills and shoot it. It takes 2 shots to kill it, so a single villager would just push it away, but they're not very big, so if you grab like 10, you're going to get a lot of bumping, which reduces your efficiency. You can just click the villagers directly onto the deer, but you might have noticed some players will garrison first and hunt the deer by ejecting from the TC. To do this, grab your vills, use B and down to reduce the selection if you need to, then press X to garrison. The TC selects when you do this, so then you hold LT and press X on the deer to set your gather point. Then you hold X again to release the villagers and hunt the deer. So that's way more complicated. Why would you do it that way? Well, if the first deer is finishing as the second comes in, the villagers are automatically going to try to hunt it and push it away, while it's still pretty far from the TC. Garrisoning can be a quick way to avoid this, and it's similarly useful to stop an inadvertent sheep kill. Garrisons can also be used to teleport units to the other side of a building, which is sometimes useful depending on what's going on under your TC and which direction the deer is coming from. Just make sure you don't press A on the deer with your town center. If you shoot it with the TC, the deer's just gonna die and you get no food. One of the most annoying ways that a push can fail is that if a deer goes untouched for several seconds, it's going to walk back to its starting position. When it's in go back mode, you can't push it until it resets, no matter how much you try. A way to avoid this is using the follow command on your scout. To do that, hold RT to open the command wheel, highlight follow and press A. A cool thing about the wheel though is that A will stick to your last input. So once it's set up, you can quickly just RT and A again without actually needing to look at the wheel and highlight follow. So I'm tapping left here on the D-pad to select my scout, then RT and A to follow. Sometimes you get lucky and this essentially auto lures the deer all the way back to your TC. But sometimes the deer is going to go just far enough that it could go back, but not far enough to actually make your scout follow it. So you still do need to pay attention to complete the push successfully. Some players like to put their scout on a control group. On Xbox, this is pretty unnecessary in my opinion, as there's a couple of good shortcuts that you can use to select without assigning any groups. You can select your scout by pressing left on the D-pad. This is the idle military hotkey, but it'll prioritize your scout, and at this point you usually have just the one unit anyway. You can also press LT and down to select cavalry, or LT and up if you have an eagle. If you're going for a drush, LT and up is also going to select those militia, so that's one situation where control grouping the eagle can be a good idea. Another tip for eagles, they're a bit slower than scouts, so it's easier to lure or lame a boar with them, as the eagle won't outrun the boar the same way that a scout would. If you want to do this, you hit the boar twice and then run home. Bonus tip, eagles can heal up in the TC too, unlike other scouts. On MegaRandom, sometimes you'll spawn with a random military unit like a skirmisher, which will kill the deer if you just click on it with A. So what you'll want to do is use X to attack move instead. This will let you push just like you could with the scout, but with no risk of laming yourself in the process. One more caveat, deer can path around objects for a surprisingly long distance, so if there's trees or gold or berries in the way, you might be in for some erratic behavior. Curiously though, this also means you can use a gate to funnel deer in towards the TC. So that's everything you need to know about pushing deer on Xbox. There's not actually all that much to it, but it can be tricky to pull off consistently, especially when you're just learning. Thanks for watching. If you learned something new about luring deer on console from this video, subscribe and ring the town bell to get notifications when I post new guides like this one.